Men with ADHD, their mental health, and Ted Lasso. That's today's episode. That's my focus. I was going through my releases and the stats for my releases and noticed that, and I'll link it in the description, one of the episodes that I did on dropping the bravado, basically encouraging men to speak up, was performing pretty well, and the retention stats are pretty good on it too. And I don't like the idea of just waiting for like a celebratory month or day or anything like that to address these topics. These are real problems. These are things that I want to see addressed more, and I want men to speak up. And I know this from personal experience too, and I also know that mental health struggles are not something that you just deal with and they go away. Oftentimes, they may in fact stagnate. Your life may stagnate or feel like it's getting stagnant. The pressure seems to mount sometimes, and it gets sometimes harder and harder to put the energy together just to reach out to somebody. Or you might feel terrified because you feel like you're kind of going against your scripting, right? Like as a boy, right? Boys don't cry, men don't cry. Be like Dirty Harry, be like Arnold Schwarzenegger, be tough, right? And then we wonder often why men die or are dying at a younger age comparative to a lot of women. And then you throw in some of the statistics about people with ADHD having shorter lifespans comparative to neurotypical people for a variety of reasons, obviously, but it's kind of like those little mini wake-up calls to yourself, at least it was for me, of like, oh, perhaps keeping things bottled up all the time is not the best approach, right? But as you know, and as I've talked about, there's no one right way of doing things, but there is a start, right? Like there's no one form of exercise that works perfectly or that solves all of the problems, but there is the one that is the beginning process for you. And it's humbling, right? Especially like if you're like me, if you're not in great shape all the time and you don't naturally get into great shape quickly, it's a humbling process. It kind of, at least for me, it kind of forces me at times to like look in the mirror, but not like at my body, but like introspectively, like this is going to be harder than you might think sometimes. And then it comes down to framing, and am I going to look at this as too difficult and just give up? Am I going to accept and appreciate aspects of that challenge? And also, like when things don't seem like they're working that well, or if I'm looking for some new ideas or feedback, who do I go to about those things? And I could talk to friends, I could talk to family members that I know that have some experience with these things, or I can seek out a professional, like with the weight training or exercise example, I might go to like a personal trainer, let's say. But when it comes to mental health, this is the invisible side of things often, right? So who do you turn to? Well, that's why I wanted to use the character of Ted Lasso, because I'll put it to you this way. When I first started watching the show, I did not take to Ted that quickly. I guess there was something about him being very smiley I didn't trust. And I don't exactly know why I didn't trust him. But I didn't. And I didn't quite understand it at first. But there was two interactions pretty early in the series that caught my attention. I guess that helps me kind of trust him a bit more. The first one is, so to kind of set the scene, forgive me, for those of you who haven't seen the show, Ted Lasso is a coach. He's your all-American, good old boy American coach, but like American sport, like football, American style, not, in terms of the rest of the world. And he's hired to become the football coach of a English premier soccer team. Well, I would call it soccer. They would call it football team, right? But the team has gone through some pretty tough times. And in fact, their owner has some pretty nefarious plans that Ted isn't aware of, obviously. But he meets her. Her name is Rebecca. He meets Rebecca for the first time. And there's a lot going on behind the scenes, and it plays out throughout the events of the first season. But what I appreciated in what Ted was doing when he first meets Rebecca is that he's very sweet. He's very charming, very complimentary, but it all comes off very authentic. Like he's not brown-nosing to his boss. He's genuinely trying to establish, as far as I can tell, a human connection with somebody. And perhaps he sees sadness in other people, which I'll get to in a second about Ted himself. But I see him seeing the good in other people, and I think he does his very best to bring that out to them, to kind of show it to them, to mirror it to them authentically so that they can begin to see it for themselves and trust themselves better, right? And what's actually pretty fascinating about his development in that first season is that he becomes the coach of a football team, of a sport in which he self-admittedly knows basically nothing about the sport, like how it works, the rules, how to train his players. I mean, fortunately, there's the other coach, Coach Beard, who clearly knows quite a bit about it. But there's another character, too. And I'll get to him in a second. But to finish off the Rebecca story, but at some point, Ted communicates to Rebecca that he wants to make her, from scratch, biscuits, like these cookies, essentially. And he does. It becomes like an ongoing aspect of the show is every morning he brings her a fresh batch of biscuits. And I believe, if I remember correctly, he really starts to crush it. I don't know if Rebecca at first wants to admit it, but he starts doing really well at the baking process too. But it's just these little moments, right? And you see that he's trying to foster these authentic connections. And then the other part that kind of began to really sell me on good old Ted was he meets a kit man, kind of an equipment manager. I think that's the best way to describe it. Named Nathan Shelley, or Nate Dogg, right? And Nate is not a footballer when you look at him. Like, he doesn't look like one of the guys you'd see on the team, right? But what he lacks in physical acumen or physical, appearance and ability, I suppose, strategically speaking, he understands the sport probably better than most of the players on that pitch. But he lacks the confidence to speak up. And I think that was kind of the major revelation turning point for me with Ted was he recognizes in Nate this ability, this intelligence, this foresight. But he also recognizes that he's kind of afraid to speak up. And he gives Nate the opportunity to speak up. Now, you would think, like, this is a man hired in a new head coach position of a team he doesn't know, in a country he doesn't live in a sport he basically knows nothing about. I'm thinking that guy is going to come in with a high chip on his shoulder, not because he has a proven track record of success, but because he probably feels like everyone's going to scrutinize everything he says or does. At least that's as far as I'm concerned. And you wouldn't think a coach would come in and just blatantly admit that he doesn't really understand the fundamental basics of how the sport is played, because understandably, most of those players would go, well, why are you our coach then, right? But what makes Ted such a great coach is that he sees potential and the goodness of others, and he shows that back to them, and they begin to trust him. And he even knows when to push some of his players, like his star player, Jamie Tart. He mucks around for practice and doesn't take it seriously. And Ted, in one of the first instances that I can remember, shows a little bit of aggression towards Jamie, kind of a passive-aggressive way, but it works. But going back to Nate's terrified of his own shadow, it seems. In fact, he wants to ask a girl out, and he can't really seem to do that for a long time either. And I think that's what makes his story arc so tragic in the second and third season, but I won't go too deep into it. But it really is, it was so heartbreaking to watch the events unfold the way they did. But now let's kind of unpack Ted in and of himself. There is this hidden struggle. And I think the viewers of the show, come to this conclusion at different times. I think different events in the story perhaps illustrate this clearly to most people. And perhaps that's why at first I was ambivalent about Ted. Because I didn't trust his hokiness. I didn't trust him being super smiley. And it turns out that he is, in my opinion, one of the best representatives of men and their mental health struggles, but also the strength of why reaching out is so important. So despite Ted Lasso being perceived as like the ultimate beacon of positivity, he's cracking the jokes, he's building the people up, he's never seemingly letting anything bring him down. As the story continues, we see the cracks, right? Like you begin to see the cracks in the facade. And then that becomes more and more apparent with the panic attacks, the trauma that's clearly pushed down further and further, and the overall ongoing kind of systematic avoidance of a lot of his bigger struggles that you begin to learn more and more as the series goes on. Like one physical representation is his geographic placement in the world, uprooting himself from the United States to the UK. But he has a wife and child at home. But you begin to learn more and more about the dynamics of that relationship too. But these anxiety attacks, the trauma, the avoidance, right? You see Ted pour himself into his work. You see him pour himself into his relationships. You see the grace and the care and the joy that he brings to other people. He is the example of how many men often deal with mental health issues. We use humor. We deflect. We sometimes resort to sheer willpower in and of itself, like willing something to happen or white-knuckling your way through times of struggle. But when it comes time or when the opportunity presents itself to speak up, most often we feel uncomfortable with that vulnerability. It almost feels like there's a spotlight that shines down on us. And you can feel the light burning you almost, right? And it feels like you're in an auditorium on a stage and the precipice of everybody, the audience is in front of you and they're mostly black. You can't really see anybody, but you can see just enough or feel just enough of their presence to know that they're watching and looking at you and most likely judging you, right? But obviously a lot of this is irrational. This is fear-based. This isn't reality. And the effects are very real in our personal lives, in our bodies, our minds, our working relationships, and our relationships across the board. But let's also focus on something that a lot of men with ADHD experience, and that's emotional regulation and avoidance. So like I mentioned, Ted Lasso shows a lot of these classic signs. He throws himself into his work. He is obsessive over the prospects of his job. He deflects the tough conversations with humor. He tries to keep things moving, keeping things light and airy. And anytime a conversation even seems to come close to him and his personal life or his problems as they present themselves, he kind of deftly pushes the conversation away. It's kind of like when you push a beach ball in the pool. If you push a beach ball lower and further under the water, invariably you're going to lose your grip, you're going to get tired, and that beach ball is going to come shooting up. It's going to splash water everywhere, right? So for a lot of guys with ADHD, emotions can sometimes feel like almost like this on and off switch. Either totally manageable, like we're in control, we got this, day to day is pretty easy, we're moving through things, or it becomes completely overwhelming. Think again about Ted's panic attacks. This is an example of what happens when emotions get bottled up for too long. So instead of taking time to really process things and even short little stints of allowing emotions to wash over or those thoughts to happen, instead of processing things in real time, a lot of times men, especially those with ADHD, we push through the distractions with humor, with work, excessive people-pleasing, right? Masking, hiding in plain sight until one day, mind and body basically hit a breaking point. So I don't mean to be dour about all this, and I want to talk about some things that can help. One of which, obviously, and I've talked about this numerous times, so forgive me if you've heard it over and over again, but I believe in it. I think there's some real power to this. It's therapy. And like I've said, there is not one form of therapy, just like there isn't one form of exercise that works the best. I think of therapy, like if you walked into a gym and let's say you had like 4 people doing 4 variations of exercise, like a Pilates, bodyweight calisthenics, guys who are doing those big dynamic movements like a squat, a bench press, a deadlift, things like that, right? If you had people in four corners of a gym doing four very different types of exercises, and you stood there and took time to really watch each of these four quadrants, these four different people, these four different examples of exercise, and you had a chance to really look at and weigh out the options of, kind of like, I know what my goals are if I want to get bigger and stronger in that way, if I want to get leaner and sleeker in this way, if I want to work on body resistance, if I want to work on stretching and flexibility, like, what are my primary goals? And also understand that you can have goals that break down into sections. Like my first set of goals are related to building up my cardiovascular, right? Getting my heart rate to stay, basically to become more comfortable pushing my body and putting stress on it, but not overexerting myself just yet. Maybe I want to lose a little bit of weight, get more accustomed, my body better fine-tuned for more stressful exercises later, right? And then perhaps you want to build in some yoga because it helps you feel physically more in control of things, but also mentally it helps you in certain ways. What I'm saying is you have your goals lined up of what the next steps are going to look like. You have a loose idea at the very least. Then you see the types of exercise options afforded to you, and you go, I want to start with this one, and then I'm going to cross over into this one, let's say. Or I might start with, my primary focus is getting toward the big dynamic movements, but I recognize my current limitations and I want to build myself up with stretching and learning about and getting more cardiovascularly involved. And then let's say in 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, I can build in these bigger, heavier, more dynamic movements over time, right? Long-winded explanation aside, that's how I kind of look at therapy. So part of the research that people sometimes fail to do when it comes to therapy is that there are different kinds, and yes, CBT and REBT may have a lot of similarities, but there are differences. There are differences in how practitioners use them. There are differences in the roles and responsibilities of the patient themselves or the client. And just like when you meet up with a personal trainer, let's say, you are not obliged to work with this person just because you took the free trial, right? Just like with therapy, you're going to do some form of intake process. You're going to ask your questions. You're going to get a better sense of insight on how the therapist or practitioner does what he or she does. And then you decide, does this make sense? Do I want to give this, let's say, a couple of weeks to see? What are my affordability options, etc.? Or does this just not make sense to me and I don't want to do it? And perhaps you might need a referral to something different, right? And who knows, you may come back in 6, 9, 12 months to that therapist ready to go. I don't know. But therapy is, to me, a really important component to this whole process. And you can combine that with medication if that makes sense to you, or other holistic approaches. It's all up to you. But being aware of yourself, your body, your mind, your emotions. Like, for example, going back to Ted, for example, Ted meets a sports psychologist named Dr. Fieldstone. So if you've watched the show, you know exactly how Ted responds almost immediately and so out of character to her once he finds out her role, and he begins to feel kind of the pressure, as it were, that he somehow has to become basically one of her patients. But throughout the season leading up to their meeting, you're also seeing the panic attacks. You're seeing the isolation. You're seeing the withdrawal, right? Him trying to numb himself to his experiences. And also the troubles that he's having at home with his wife, well, ish, and son. However, you also see over time how therapy becomes a game changer. Unfortunately, for a lot of men, there's a fear that therapy is either going to make them weak. Somehow vulnerability has been conflated with being weird or weak, right? That feelings and talking about your feelings is something girls do, quote, and I'm using finger quotes. Or that they're afraid of being, quote unquote, fixed. But let's focus on reality right now. It's about understanding your mind and giving yourself that needed permission to feel, to breathe, to process, to express, and make changes in your life accordingly. And this also comes with breaking the avoidance loop. Instead of running from those difficult conversations or emotions, taking the time to practice small moments of sitting with your discomfort. Most likely, if you're suffering mentally, you are sitting with those moments of discomfort anyway, right? The anxiety, the depression, the frustration, the anger, perhaps indifference at times, right? Why not do so strategically and with a guided purpose behind it? Why not take the time to gain insight and wisdom, to over time perhaps find a degree of comfort with these feelings, to identify them how they are, to reframe and to restructure how you talk to yourself, how you talk about yourself, and also how you reach out to other people if you do at all. And that's actually, when you think about it, a parallel to the real world. Like, think about it. How often do men actually open up to their friends about what they're going through? Unfortunately, for a lot of guys, even just admitting that they are struggling elicits a sense of failure on their part, like to themselves, or they may perceive their buddies to think like, oh, what's Jimmy's problem, right? Like, why is he complaining? None of us complain. We just go about our business. We just strap our bootstraps and we just go, right? Even though, let's be honest, Jimmy and the rest of the schmucks, those guys are also suffering in silence too, most likely. You know what it is too? All right. What's also fascinating about this whole process I've learned over time as a man and as a person trying to better themselves, when you approach some people that you know from the angle of like, I want to get better, those that are probably stuck suffering themselves usually respond really poorly and really strongly to those situations. Like, it's almost as if they take it as like a personal challenge. Like, you're going to therapy? Who does that, right? Like, guys don't do that. We don't do that. You shouldn't be doing that because you're showing that you're improving yourself. And that scares me. But that's something heartbreaking, an aspect of Ted's story, that he internalizes this idea, or at least has on some level internalized this idea, that he has to be the strong one for everybody else. Right? And like, as men, we're taught that our values come from how we handle situations for other people and how much we can handle, or in this case, tolerate. Because I can handle some things until I can't. But tolerating things, it's like a repugnant smell. Like, you tolerate it, but you're not happy to be there. And how little we often sometimes, quote unquote, need in return. And I see myself doing this, like when it comes to gifts, like for Christmas or my birthday. I, in my mind, have it set that I am an easy person to shop for, much to the contrary of what I'm sure my wife has told me numerous times. Because I, just like my dad, I don't need anything. I have everything I need. It's not exactly true, but, who am I to ask for something, right? Ted does this, unfortunately, to a fault. Like, he gives and he gives, but he rarely allows himself to be supported. So what can Ted do, and what does Ted start to do? Well, and what can we do too? So from the start, you can see that Ted is obviously very gifted at making relationships and fostering genuine connections with other people. Like, that's pretty obvious from the beginning. However, it's what drives or fuels him to do so may or may not be the main culprit here. Like I said with the biscuit example, like, I don't think he was coming off as being needy. I don't think he was coming off to Rebecca as being a brown noser. I think he genuinely wanted to have that connection with his boss. I think he wanted to make her feel appreciated. But I think there was also some ulterior reasons baked into that reasoning or that drive as well. However, building a support network or building a support system means having friends, having family, having professionals on your side and in your corner that know you authentically. Like, we talk about masking, like neurodivergent masking, but there's like depression masking, anxiety. There are high functioning people who go through mental health issues too, right? Who seemingly have it all together, but on the inside, they're crumbling, right? So when they reach out and ask for help, in some cases, some of those people, even those closest to them, might go like, wow, I didn't realize that you were going through this, right? But that means that those honest conversations can really start to take hold. And like I had mentioned before, and I've talked about this in the past, reframing your thought process and how you reframing what your interpretations and your cognitions of certain things are, like your feelings, but also your attitudes towards things like strength, right? Like I said, boys are often taught to be strong, to be stoic, not to cry, right? Real men don't cry. Boys are tough. You pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You rub some dirt on it. You walk it off. You don't be a bitch. But true strength isn't about carrying the most weight. True strength is knowing when to set it down and when to ask for help. And think about it in the practical sense when it comes to exercising. You can't always carry those weights around. Like if you had a weighted vest, let's say, and every day you wore 50 pounds, 60 pounds, 80 pounds, right? Your body is going to start to twist and contort to offset that weight, but it's always weighted on your chest. It's always weighted on your back. It's always weighted on your legs. It's always weighted on your body and on your mind. And yet, the moment you ask for help and you unstrap that weighted vest, everything begins to change. And I think that's where we get stress messed up. Like, there is such a thing as good stress. Like, there is such a thing as performance anxiety. Like, before I give a presentation, I'm a little bit anxious because I want to do well. But if I am carrying that anxiety with me all the time and I'm bordering on panic at times, that's when a conversation needs to be had with somebody else, right? To really go through what's going on in my mind and help me through that process. And lastly, self-compassion. Like, this is, I think, what's so heartbreaking and so earnest about Ted. The way he treats other people, his kindness, the level of care and respect and genuine openness that he presents to other people. The things that he helps other people see about themselves and hopefully helps them learn how to treat themselves better. Imagine if he gave himself just a small piece, a fraction of that same level of care, grace, energy, whatever you want to call it. Imagine that. And that's the frustrating thing, is that men deserve it too. So what is the takeaway here from Ted Lasso's journey? Well, first, even the most positive, put-together people can struggle substantially, and a lot of them often do. Second, avoiding emotions does not make them disappear, like I gave you the example of the beach ball pushed into the pool. It only delays the fallout, and let's be honest, often makes it a lot worse. It exacerbates it. Third, seeking help, setting boundaries, embracing vulnerability. These are not signs of weakness. Do you hear me, listener? Are you hearing me? Me? They are whatever you want to call them. Superpowers, strengths, leadership qualities, whatever you want to call it, that's what they are. So I hope this was helpful. I'll be honest with you. In the moment, thinking about it, it was helpful for me. I think that's why I like the show, and I'm probably going to revisit it soon. Ted just felt like a guy that I would like to know, that I would like to have in my life. And if I'm being honest, the kind of guy I wish or want, I should say, aspire to be. And I appreciate that he's flawed. I appreciate that they show his struggle, but they don't glamorize it. They don't over Hollywoodize it. You know what I mean? Like, it felt real. It felt threatening. Those panic attacks felt threatening to me. And I wasn't even having them. And I felt frustrated at him when he wouldn't take the help at first. And I felt jubilant for him when he did. And he began to grow. Thank you substantially for listening this far. I greatly appreciate you. And I genuinely want for you, to any gentleman out there listening, struggling in any capacity, I genuinely want for you to reach out today to somebody, someone you know, someone you trust. Maybe you reach out to a professional. Perhaps it's gone on for too long. And just start asking questions. Just start getting some insights. Take it one step at a time. Like I mentioned with the 4-corner example, the 4 types of exercise example at the gym. You don't have to make any decisions right now. You can change your mind at any point. You can cross-connect different approaches. Lead with what interests you, and listen to your body and your mind. Go with what really makes sense to you. And just recognize that this is going to take some time. All right? You're doing great, man. Don't sell yourself short. Really. I believe in you. I think you're doing wonderful. I truly trust that you can be doing even better over time. But I'm not going to place that weight on you. You work at your own pace, man. Thank you.